Whenever a culture tells jokes about a particular passage in the Bible, you can know that there's something about that passage that grabs the heart, the soul, the mind. If you were to Google jokes, Jesus walking on water, you'll find hundreds, if not thousands, of jokes. There is something about this passage that grabs us. In fact, when I was the chaplain at a college in Baltimore, a member, in fact, she was the captain of the women's swimming team, arrived at my office just before swim season began and gave me a cartoon. It showed women stroking very vigorously through those lanes that you see in races, in pools, and striding out ahead of them on very large sandals was Jesus. The cartoon stayed on my door for all of my 10 years at Goucher. Every day I'd walk in thinking about Jesus striding on the water ahead of whatever faced me. Whatever faces you, Jesus is out in front. Jesus has been there before you. Jesus knows your heart's deepest joy and your soul's greatest terrors. Jesus has been there before you. I don't know what fears you brought here today, but I know that because you and I are human beings who share with Jesus the full humanity that God gives us, that you have fears. However deep they are or shallow, sometimes you feel as if those fears might drown you. And it's a good biblical image, fear of drowning. You may or may not know that in the Jewish culture, and in fact throughout the Middle East, the great symbol for chaos and evil were overwhelming waters. If you don't believe me, go and read the opening of the book of Genesis, where the Spirit of God hovers over the face of the waters, waters of chaos, waters of deep fear, waters that would terrify anyone, and God orders the waters back. Unlike King Canute of myth, God can order waters. The waters of your fears and mine, the waters of Jesus' fears and Peter's fears, yours and mine. This story is not about a magic trick of Jesus skidding across the water. It's about God's ability, God's deep-seated, loving ability to order the things that terrify us, to go before us in the things that terrify us, and to order that space so that we are not alone. Notice I didn't say that God would make the waves and the wind go away. Those of you who know me know I don't like to preach cheap grace. I don't like to make promises in God's name that can't be fulfilled. There will be winds and waters in your life and mine, as there have already been. But you will not be alone. You weren't alone in any of the winds and waters that you've gone through before, and you won't be alone in any that lie ahead. Did you notice how terrified they were, not of the storm, but of this presence coming to them on the water? It says, the text does, that they cry out in fear, thinking that Jesus is a ghost. Now, most of us in the 21st century don't pay much attention to ghosts. But in Jesus' day, a ghost was a symbol of those spiritual forces that cannot be controlled, just the way that winds and waters can't be controlled. In other words, the disciples are terrified of the natural and the more than natural. They're just plain, flat out afraid. But did you notice that that is where God, in the person of Jesus, is? Right in the midst of their fears. The story doesn't say that Jesus calms the wind and the waves and then they recognize that God is present. Jesus appears in the midst of what's terrifying. Then and now. For Peter, for you, for me, that is one of the places that God appears, in the midst of our fears. Now, what in the world is Peter up to that once Jesus identifies himself, leads him to say, well, if it is you, ask me to come out onto the water. In fact, command me to come out onto the water. Is he out of his mind? Is he out of his mind? Well, in one way, one might say yes, he is out of his mind. Maybe he's moved out of the logical left brain where most of us live most of our days into that other part of what it is to be human. Call it intuition or instinct. Call it what you will. Peter moves into that other place that knows in his gut that if he is going to survive the fear that he's experiencing, he needs a companion. He cannot, he will not, he may not endure that fear by himself. He needs Jesus. And so he wants to be where Jesus is and commands Jesus to command him to come, which Jesus does. Without hesitation, Jesus says, come. Come. Come to me. You know the rest of the line. Come to me, all you who labor and are weary and are bearing heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Come to me, you who are fearful. I will be your companion. I will be your companion. Peter seems to have the wisdom to know what all of us should know, that when we sink into fear, there's no reason for shame. Instead, there's reason for hope. Hope that there might be a companion in the midst of the fear. There's reason to call on God, to ask that God invite us to be where God is in the midst of our fear. It's not just Peter, you know, this week who's terrified. You probably don't, most of you, remember the context for Elijah hiding in that cave. But let me remind you, he's running for his life. He's been in battle with the king and queen of Israel's priests who are worshiping a false god named Baal. And he's managed to win the battle, but he's afraid he's going to lose the war because he's afraid that Jezebel and Ahab are going to come after him now. And so he runs for his life and hides in the cave. Notice that just like Jesus comes to Peter in the midst of his fear, Elijah experiences God coming to him in the midst of his fear. Not in a great display of power, not in earthquake, not in heavy wind, not in fire, but in what used to be called the still small voice, or in the modern translation, the sound of sheer silence. Do you know what you hear in the sound of sheer silence? You can hear your heart beating. Take heart, Jesus says. It is I. Take heart. Listen to your heart. Listen to your fear and do what your fear tells you. Seek me out as a companion. And then take another heart. Take my heart. Take my hand, take my heart. Let me be with you in your fear, because you won't survive it without me. You won't survive it without my heart and your heart merging, and my hand in yours. You will drown. You need a courage greater than your own, and so do I. We need God's courage, Jesus' courage, a heart and courage greater than anything we can imagine, a heart and courage that tames the forces of chaos. So what fears did you bring here today? Is your marriage falling apart? Or you fear it is? Or do you fear that the world has gone mad with wars in Syria, Iraq, and Africa? Or do you fear those storms that seem to be happening more and more in our world because of global warming? Or are you terrified that Ebola has leaped the ocean and come here? Are you fearful of the depression that stalks you in the night? Or the alcoholism that makes you grab a bottle even though you know it's killing you? What are you afraid of? You are not alone in any of those fears. Jesus has gone before you. Jesus has met all those fears, and if you don't believe me, remember some of the stories we hear about him. His first act of ministry after his baptism is to face 40 days of fear in the wilderness. And then he faces fear after fear after fear. The diseased ones. Think Jesus touching someone with Ebola. The hungry ones in crowds on the hillside that could have overrun him. The forces that kept his people under their thumb, the oppressive political and economic forces of Rome. The corrupt religious leaders who only cared about their well-being and not those they were trampling on. Jesus has been there before you, before me, in every fear we can imagine. And he says to us as we sink, "Oh, my dear little trusting one. My dear little mustard seed. So little faith, but just enough. Just enough. You've reached out your hand. You've taken hold of it. Let me hold your hand." Like a father or mother holding the back of a bicycle seat as you learn to ride a two-wheeler, and then lets go, and you panic and are about to fall over, Jesus runs behind you and takes the seat again and says, "You can do it, my little mustard seed. You can do it. With my heart in yours and my hand in yours, you can do it." So when you come to communion this morning, stretch out your hand and know that He will put His whole self in your hand. Sip the cup of His courage so that you can face whatever fears beset you today, tomorrow, and in the days to come. And know this, that if you take heart, if you know that you are never alone, you will be raised up to new life, even as your life ebbs away. Amen.